When 16-year-old Celeste signed away her family's Kansas homestead to save her dying brother's life, she thought she had lost everything that mattered. But as a mysterious wounded rancher lay dying in her arms, his final wish would either damn them both forever or transform two desperate orphans into the most powerful landowners in 3 counties. What price would you pay to discover that your greatest sacrifice was actually your greatest gift? The crack of splitting would echo across the empty Kansas plains as Celeste's axe bit deep into the old fence post. Sweat dripped from her forehead despite the cool morning air of September 1867. Each swing sent sharp pains through her blistered hands, but she couldn't stop. The fence had to be fixed before the neighbors' cattle wandered onto their land again. "Celeste!" Marcus called from the cabin doorway, his voice weak and scratchy. "I can't find the medicine bottle." Her heart sank like a stone in deep water. The last of their father's cough syrup had run out 2 days ago. She dropped the axe and wiped her dirty hands on her worn brown dress. The fabric had once been her Sunday best, but now it served as work clothes, play clothes, and everything in between. Walking toward the small log cabin their father had built 3 years ago, Celeste studied her younger brother's pale face. Dark circles ringed his green eyes, and his thin shoulders shook with each cough. At 12 years old, Marcus should have been running through the tall grass, chasing rabbits and climbing trees. Instead, he spent most days lying in bed, getting weaker by the hour. "We used the last of it on Tuesday, remember?" she said gently, placing her hand on his warm forehead. His skin felt hot as a summer stone. "But I'll figure something out." Their parents had died in late June when a terrible sickness swept through their small farming community. One by one, families had packed their wagons and headed east toward safer towns. Now only the Wheeler children remained on their 160-acre homestead, trying to survive on what little they had left. Celeste walked to the kitchen window and stared out at the endless grassland. The nearest town sat 40 miles away, a full day's journey by their old mule and wagon. Even if they made the trip, she had counted their money 3 times. $12.37 wouldn't buy much medicine, and certainly not enough to cure whatever was eating away at Marcus's strength. The sound of approaching horses made her freeze. Visitors were rare these days, and most folks who came calling brought either bad news or empty promises. She peered through the cracked glass and saw 3 men riding toward their cabin. They sat tall in their saddles, wearing dark coats and wide-brimmed hats that shadowed their faces. "Marcus, go lie down," she whispered, not wanting the strangers to see how sick he was. The lead rider dismounted near their well, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He was a thin man with sharp features and cold gray eyes that reminded Celeste of winter ice. The other 2 stayed on their horses, hands resting near the guns on their hips. "Miss Wheeler?" the thin man asked, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed more mocking than polite. "My name is Crenshaw. I work for Mr. Blackwood down in Wichita." Celeste had heard that name whispered in town, always with fear, never with respect. Blackwood owned businesses, land, and people said he had ways of getting whatever he wanted. "We're not selling," she said quickly, crossing her arms over her chest. Crenshaw smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "Now that's interesting. I haven't even told you why I'm here." He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Though you're right about one thing, this is about your land." The paper crackled as he unfolded it, revealing official-looking stamps and signatures. "You see, the railroad is coming through these parts. They need a straight line from Kansas City to Denver, and your little farm sits right in the perfect spot." Celeste's mouth went dry. The railroad meant progress, jobs, and money for some people. But for families like hers, it often meant forced sales and broken dreams. "Your father was offered a fair price last spring," Crenshaw continued, walking closer to the cabin. $500 for land that's barely worth $50. But he was stubborn, said he'd never sell the place where his children were born. "This is our home," Celeste said, her voice stronger than she felt inside. "Was your home," Crenshaw corrected. "Dead men don't need houses, and sick boys don't need much of anything for very long." The words hit her like a physical blow. How did he know about Marcus's illness? Had someone in town been talking? As if reading her thoughts, Crenshaw nodded toward the cabin window where Marcus's pale face was visible. Word travels fast in small communities, especially when children are left all alone to face the world. One of the mounted men shifted in his saddle, his hand moving closer to his gun. The message was clear. They weren't just making an offer. They were making a threat. "We'll give you 48 hours to think it over," Crenshaw said, folding the paper and tucking it back into his coat. "Sign the deed, take the money, and find somewhere else to start fresh. Refuse, and well." He shrugged as if the outcome didn't matter to him. Sometimes sick children don't recover from their illnesses. The three men rode away in a cloud of dust, leaving Celeste standing alone in the yard, with her heart pounding like a drum. She watched until they disappeared over the eastern hill, then ran back into the cabin where Marcus was struggling to sit up in bed. "Who were those men?" he asked between coughs. "They looked mean." Celeste sat on the edge of his bed and took his thin hand in hers. How could she explain that everything their parents had worked for was about to be stolen? How could she tell him that powerful men in faraway cities had decided their little farm was worth more empty than occupied? "Just some business people," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Marcus was smarter than his 12 years. He had always been able to see through her attempts to protect him. "They want our land, don't they? Like the men who came to the Morrison place last month." Celeste remembered hearing about the Morrison family. They had owned a small ranch 5 miles north until mysterious accidents started happening. Their well water turned bad, their cattle got sick, and finally their barn caught fire in the middle of the night. Within a week, they had packed up and moved back east, selling their land for almost nothing. "We're not the Morrisons," she said firmly. "We're Wheelers, and Wheelers don't give up without a fight." That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the grassland, Celeste sat at their small kitchen table trying to make sense of their situation. She had spread out all their important papers, the deed to their land, her father's will, and the few dollars they had left. The land deed showed that their father had owned 160 acres free and clear. He had worked for 3 years to pay off the government loan, clearing fields and building their cabin with his own hands. The soil was good for growing corn and wheat, and there was fresh water from the creek that ran along their southern border. But what good was rich soil if they didn't live long enough to plant crops? What use was fresh water if Marcus died from whatever sickness was consuming him from the inside? She picked up her mother's hand mirror and studied her reflection in the flickering lamplight. At 16, she looked older than her years. Hard work and worry had sharpened her features, and her brown hair hung in tangles around her shoulders. Her hands were rough and calloused from chopping wood, hauling water, and trying to keep their small farm running. Marcus coughed again from the bedroom, a wet sound that made her stomach twist with fear. She had watched their parents die from fever just 3 months ago. First her mother had taken to bed with chills and sweating. Then her father had fallen ill while trying to care for his wife. Within 2 weeks, both were buried in the small cemetery behind their cabin. Now the same symptoms were appearing in Marcus, the fever, the cough, the way he grew weaker each day. She had no medicine, no doctor, and no money to pay for either. A sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin windows, and Celeste shivered despite the warmth from their small fireplace. Storm clouds were gathering on the western horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of rain. In the distance, she could hear the lonely howl of a coyote calling to its pack. She walked to Marcus's bedside and felt his forehead again. His fever was getting worse, and his breathing sounded shallow and quick. If she was going to save his life, she needed to make a choice soon. The deed lay on the table like a death sentence, waiting for her signature. $500 would buy medicine, food, and passage to a town with a real doctor. It would give Marcus a chance to live, even if it meant giving up everything their family had built. But signing that paper would also mean letting the bad men win. It would mean that bullies with guns and lawyers could take whatever they wanted from people who couldn't fight back. Her father had died rather than surrender to Crenshaw's threats. Was she stronger than him, or was she just more desperate? Outside, thunder rumbled across the plains like the sound of approaching horses. The storm was coming whether she was ready or not, and she had until tomorrow night to decide which mattered more: the land that held their family's dreams, or the brother who held her heart. Lightning split the black sky as Celeste's trembling hand hovered over the deed, ink from the pen dripping onto the wooden table like tears. The storm had arrived with furious winds that shook their cabin walls and sent rain hammering against the windows. Each thunderclap seemed to echo the pounding of her heart as she struggled with the most important decision of her life. Marcus had been unconscious for 2 hours now, his breathing so shallow she had to lean close to make sure he was still alive. His lips had turned a frightening shade of blue, and his skin felt cold despite the fever burning inside him. Time was running out faster than water through a broken dam. She pressed the pen to paper and slowly wrote her name across the bottom of the deed. Each letter felt like she was carving it into her own gravestone. Celeste Marie Wheeler, the signature that would end her family's claim to the land her father had died protecting. The moment she finished writing, Marcus stirred in his bed. His eyes fluttered open, clearer than they had been in days, and he looked directly at her with an expression that seemed far too wise for a 12-year-old boy. "Did you sign it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. Celeste folded the deed quickly, but not quickly enough. Marcus had always been able to read her face like an open book. "I had to," she said, tears mixing with the rainwater that had leaked through their damaged roof. "You're more important than any piece of land. Papa wouldn't have signed it." The words cut deeper than any knife. Their father had been stubborn as a mule and twice as proud. He would have fought Crenshaw's men with his bare hands before giving up their homestead. But their father hadn't watched his son slowly dying while having no power to help. "Papa didn't have to choose between his pride and his child's life," Celeste replied, sitting on the edge of Marcus's bed. "I'd rather have you alive in a strange place than lose you here where you belong." Marcus reached out with one thin hand and touched her cheek. "What if we both end up dead anyway? What if they lied about letting us go?" The question sent ice through her veins because she had been thinking the same thing. Men like Crenshaw didn't get rich by keeping their promises to poor farm children. Once they had the signed deed, what would stop them from getting rid of the only witnesses to their threats? A new sound cut through the storm, horses approaching fast despite the terrible weather. Celeste rushed to the window and peered through the streaming glass. 3 riders were coming up their path, but these weren't Crenshaw's men. These horses moved differently, with the careful steps of animals carrying injured riders. The lead horse stumbled and nearly fell as it reached their yard. The man in the saddle swayed dangerously, one hand pressed against his side where dark stains spread across his shirt. Even through the rain and darkness, Celeste could see he was hurt badly. "Someone's coming," she told Marcus, who was trying to sit up despite his weakness. "A hurt man. We have to help him," Marcus said with surprising strength in his voice. "Mama always said to help folks in trouble." Celeste grabbed her father's old coat and ran outside into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her down, and the rain soaked through her dress in seconds. The injured man was sliding from his horse, barely conscious and bleeding heavily. "Please," he gasped as she reached him. "Need shelter. Bad men following." She managed to get her shoulder under his arm and half-carried, half-dragged him toward the cabin. He was heavier than her father had been, and she could feel warm blood seeping through his clothes onto her hands. But something about his voice, the way he had said "bad men," made her think he might be running from the same people who were threatening her family. Inside the cabin, she helped him onto the old sofa near the fireplace. In the lamplight, she could see he was older than she had first thought, maybe 40 years old, with gray threading through his dark hair and deep lines around his eyes. His clothes were well-made but torn and dirty from hard riding. "Thank you," he breathed, looking around the small room. His gaze stopped on Marcus, who was watching from his bed with bright, curious eyes. "You're the Wheeler children." Celeste froze. How did this stranger know their names? Was he another one of Blackwood's men, using a trick to get inside their home? "Don't be afraid," the man said, noticing her fear. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because of your father." "Our father is dead," Marcus said quietly. I know. And I think I know why. The stranger winced as he shifted position, his hands still pressed against his wounded side. My name is James Hartwell. I own the big ranch about 20 miles south of here. Your father wrote me a letter before he died. Celeste had never heard of James Hartwell, but she had heard of the Hartwell Ranch. Everyone in 3 counties knew about the huge spread of land with thousands of cattle and dozens of workers. If this man was telling the truth, he was one of the richest people in Kansas. What kind of letter? She asked, still suspicious. The kind a man writes when he knows he's in danger, Hartwell replied. The kind that talks about poisoned wells, mysterious fires, and cattle dying from sickness that only affects certain farms. Marcus struggled to sit up straighter. You mean the accidents weren't really accidents? Hartwell's eyes grew hard as winter stone. There are no accidents when Blackwood wants something. Only carefully planned attacks made to look like bad luck. Outside, the storm was getting worse. Thunder crashed overhead like cannon fire, and the wind howled through the trees like angry spirits. But inside the warm cabin, a different kind of storm was brewing as Celeste began to understand that her parents' deaths might not have been from natural sickness after all. Are you saying someone killed our mother and father? She whispered. Before Hartwell could answer, new sounds reached them through the storm, more horses, multiple riders moving fast despite the dangerous weather. These weren't injured travelers seeking shelter. These were hunters tracking their prey. They found me, Hartwell said, trying to stand despite his wounds. I'm sorry. I've brought trouble to your door. But Celeste was already moving, grabbing her father's hunting rifle from above the fireplace. She had never shot at a person before, but she had hunted rabbits and deer enough times to know how to use the weapon. You helped us by telling the truth about our parents, she said, checking to make sure the rifle was loaded. Now we'll help you. The sound of splintering would echo through the cabin as someone kicked in their front door, sending it crashing against the wall with a bang that made Marcus jump in his bed. 3 men in dark coats pushed inside, water streaming from their hats and boots as they shook off the storm. Crenshaw led the way, his thin face twisted with anger and his gun already drawn. Well, he said, his cold eyes taking in the scene, Hartwell bleeding on their sofa, Celeste standing with the rifle, and Marcus trying to look braver than any sick 12-year-old should have to. Looks like we've got ourselves a regular family reunion. Behind Crenshaw, his 2 men spread out to block the windows and the back door. They moved like wolves surrounding prey, cutting off every escape route with practiced efficiency. The cabin suddenly felt very small and very dangerous. You're trespassing, Celeste said, raising the rifle to her shoulder the way her father had taught her. Her hands shook, but her voice stayed steady. Get out of our house. Crenshaw laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Your house? Child, you signed this place over to Mr. Blackwood not 2 hours ago. He pulled the deed from his coat, the ink still wet from where she had written her name. This cabin belongs to us now, and so does everything in it. Including witnesses who've seen too much, added one of his men, a heavy-set man with scars across his knuckles. Hartwell tried to stand but fell back onto the sofa with a groan of pain. Blood had soaked through the bandage Celeste had wrapped around his ribs, and his face was pale as fresh snow. The girl and boy have nothing to do with this, Crenshaw. Your fight is with me. My fight is with anyone who gets in Mr. Blackwood's way, Crenshaw replied, taking a step closer to Celeste. And right now, that includes a meddling rancher and 2 orphan brats who don't know when to keep quiet. Marcus surprised everyone by speaking up from his bed, his young voice cutting through the tension like a knife. We know you killed our parents. The words hung in the air like smoke from gunpowder. Crenshaw's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits, and his finger tightened on the trigger of his gun. For a moment, the only sounds were the storm raging outside and the heavy breathing of scared people inside. That's a serious accusation, boy, Crenshaw said slowly. The kind that could get a person hurt. The kind that's also true, Hartwell said, his voice growing stronger despite his wounds. I've been investigating Blackwood's methods for months. The poisoned cattle feed, the contaminated well water, the mysterious fevers that only strike families who won't sell their land. Celeste felt the world tilting beneath her feet like a boat in rough water. You're saying they murdered our parents on purpose? I'm saying they've been murdering families across 3 counties, Hartwell replied, making it look like accidents and disease so no one asks too many questions. One of Crenshaw's men shifted nervously by the window. Boss, maybe we should just finish this and get out of here. Storm's getting worse. But Crenshaw seemed to be enjoying himself too much to hurry. He walked closer to Marcus's bed. His gun pointed casually at the boy's chest. The thing about sick children, he said conversationally, is that they die from the smallest things. A pillow over the face during a fever dream. A little too much medicine by mistake. Tragic accidents that break a sister's heart. Don't you touch him, Celeste snarled, swinging the rifle toward Crenshaw. Or what? You'll shoot me? Crenshaw smiled coldly. Little girls don't have the stomach for killing, even when they're protecting their baby brothers. He was wrong. In that moment, looking at Marcus's pale face and thinking about her parents' slow, painful deaths, Celeste discovered she had more stomach for violence than she had ever imagined. Her finger found the trigger, and she took careful aim at Crenshaw's chest. But before she could fire, new sounds reached them from outside. More horses, but these were different. These moved with purpose and discipline, like trained soldiers rather than hired thugs. Through the broken door, Celeste could see lanterns bobbing in the darkness and hear men calling out commands. That's my ranch hands, Hartwell said with the first smile Celeste had seen from him. I told them where I was going before I left. Took them a while to track me in this storm, but cowboys are good at following trails. Crenshaw's confidence cracked like ice on a warm day. He looked toward his men, who were already backing toward the door. 3 against 3 had been good odds. 3 against a dozen ranch hands was a different story entirely. This isn't over, Crenshaw said, but he was already moving toward the door. Blackwood doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive. Neither do I, said a new voice from the doorway. A tall man in a dripping raincoat stepped into the cabin, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. Behind him, Celeste could see more men with lanterns and rifles, surrounding the cabin like protective angels. The newcomer had gray hair and kind eyes, but there was something dangerous in the way he moved. Jake Morrison, foreman of the Hartwell Ranch, he said to Crenshaw. You boys need to leave. Now. For a moment it looked like Crenshaw might try to fight his way out. His hand twitched toward his gun, and his men tensed like springs ready to snap. But then lightning flashed outside, illuminating the faces of Morrison's men, and Crenshaw seemed to realize he was outnumbered and outgunned. We'll be back, he said, backing toward the door. Count on it. We'll be ready, Morrison replied calmly. As the 3 men disappeared into the storm, Celeste finally lowered her rifle. Her arms ached from holding it steady, and she realized she was shaking all over. She had come within seconds of shooting a man, and part of her wished she had pulled the trigger. Morrison knelt beside Hartwell, examining his wounds with the practiced eye of someone who had seen plenty of injuries. How bad is it, boss? Bad enough, Hartwell admitted. But I'll live long enough to see this through. Marcus sat up in his bed, and for the first time in weeks, there was color in his cheeks and strength in his voice. Mr. Hartwell, what happens to us now? We signed away our land, and those men know we can identify them. Hartwell looked at the boy with something like admiration. That's a good question, son, and I think I might have a good answer. Blood pooled beneath James Hartwell as he lay dying on their cabin floor, his breath coming in short, painful gasps that seemed to echo the fading thunder outside. The storm was passing, but inside the small room, a different kind of tempest was brewing as the wounded rancher struggled to speak words that might change everything. Get me my saddlebags, he whispered to Morrison, who knelt beside him with tears streaming down his weathered face. There's something the children need to see. Celeste pressed a clean cloth against the worst of Hartwell's wounds, but she could feel his life slipping away like water through her fingers. The ride through the storm had reopened his injuries, and too much blood had been lost. Even Marcus, sitting up in his bed with newfound strength, could see that their unexpected savior wouldn't survive another hour. Morrison returned with the leather saddlebags, his hands shaking as he opened them. Inside were official-looking documents, maps marked with red ink, and a thick envelope sealed with wax. But what caught everyone's attention was a small wooden box that seemed too precious for a cowboy's gear. "Open it," Hartwell breathed, his eyes fixed on Celeste with an intensity that made her heart race. Inside the box lay a silver locket on a delicate chain, obviously made for a woman. Engraved on its surface were the initials MH and a date from 20 years ago. When Celeste opened it, she found a tiny photograph of a beautiful young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "My wife, Margaret," Hartwell said, his voice growing weaker with each word. "She died giving birth to our first child. The baby didn't survive either." Marcus struggled to understand. "But what does that have to do with us?" Hartwell's eyes moved between the two children, and something like peace crossed his pain-filled face. 20 years I've run that ranch alone. 20 years I've wondered what kind of father I would have been, what kind of children Margaret and I might have raised together." Morrison pulled out the sealed envelope and held it where Hartwell could see it. The wax bore the official stamp of a lawyer's office, and across the front was written, "Last Will and Testament of James Edward Hartwell." "I had this drawn up last month," Hartwell explained, each word an effort. "When I started investigating Blackwood's crimes, I knew I might not survive. A man needs to know his life's work will continue after he's gone." Celeste felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying." Hartwell paused for a long, shuddering breath. "I'm saying I want to leave my ranch to you and Marcus. All of it. The land, the cattle, the buildings, everything." The words hit the cabin like another lightning strike. Morrison's eyes went wide with shock, while Marcus nearly fell out of his bed, trying to process what he had just heard. Celeste could only stare at the dying man, wondering if the blood loss had affected his mind. "You don't even know us," she whispered. "We're just poor farm children." "You're the kind of people this country needs," Hartwell replied with surprising strength. "You chose love over safety, sacrifice over selfishness. You faced down armed men to protect each other and a stranger." His gaze moved to Marcus. "And you, boy, you've got the courage to speak truth even when it's dangerous." Morrison carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the will. His lips moved as he read silently, and his expression grew more amazed with each line. "Boss, this is really what you want?" "It's what Margaret would have wanted," Hartwell said. "She always believed children should inherit a better world than the one their parents lived in." Outside, the storm clouds were breaking apart, allowing moonlight to stream through the cabin windows. But inside, the weight of Hartwell's offer pressed down on them like a physical thing. The Hartwell ranch was worth more money than Celeste could imagine: thousands of cattle, hundreds of acres of prime grazing land, and a house bigger than their entire cabin. "There's more," Hartwell continued, his voice growing fainter. "In my desk at the main house, there's evidence about Blackwood's crimes. Letters from other families he's threatened, records of the poison he's been using, names of the men he's hired to do his dirty work." Marcus leaned forward eagerly. "Enough to put him in jail?" "Enough to hang him," Morrison said grimly, "if we can get it to the right people." Hartwell's breathing became more labored, and Celeste could see him struggling against the darkness that was closing in. "Promise me," he gasped, reaching out to grab her hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll use that evidence to stop him. Don't let other families suffer like yours did." The responsibility felt overwhelming. How could two orphan children take on a powerful man like Blackwood? How could they run a huge ranch when they had barely managed to keep their small farm going? But then Celeste looked at Marcus, sitting up straighter than he had in weeks, color returning to his cheeks as if Hartwell's gift was already healing him. She thought about their parents, lying in the cold ground because they had refused to be bullied. She thought about all the other families who might face the same threats if Blackwood wasn't stopped. "We promise," she said firmly, squeezing Hartwell's hand. "We'll make them pay for what they did." Hartwell smiled then, the first truly peaceful expression she had seen on his face. "Good. Morrison will help you." He knows the ranch better than anyone, and he's been like a brother to me for 15 years. The foreman nodded, tears still flowing down his weathered cheeks. I'll take care of them, boss, just like they were my own. As the night wore on, Hartwell shared stories about his ranch, his dreams for the land, and his hopes for the future. He told them about the best grazing areas, the most reliable water sources, and which of his men could be trusted completely. With each detail, Celeste began to understand the magnitude of what he was offering them. But more than that, she began to understand why he was doing it. James Hartwell had spent 20 years building something meaningful, and he wanted to ensure that his life's work would continue in the hands of people who understood the difference between right and wrong. As dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Hartwell's breathing became slower and more peaceful. He looked at the two children who would inherit everything he had worked for, and his final words were barely audible. Take care of each other, take care of the land, and never let the bullies win. The morning sun revealed a transformed world as Morrison's men dug a grave behind the Wheeler cabin, their shovels biting into earth still soft from the night's rain. James Hartwell lay wrapped in a clean blanket, his face peaceful in death, while Celeste and Marcus stood watching their unexpected benefactor being laid to rest beside their parents. He should be buried on his own land, Celeste said quietly, feeling the weight of the silver locket around her neck, Hartwell's final gift to her. He is, Morrison replied, consulting the legal papers they had studied by lamplight. According to this will, everything that was his is now yours. This whole valley, from the creek to the hills, belongs to the Hartwell Ranch. Your parents' graves are on Hartwell land now. The idea still seemed impossible. Yesterday they had been poor orphans facing eviction and death. Today they owned one of the largest ranches in Kansas, with more cattle than Celeste could count and enough money to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. But with great wealth came great responsibility, and the evidence hidden in Hartwell's desk could either save dozens of families or get them all killed trying. We need to get to the main house, Marcus said, his voice stronger than it had been in months. Whatever sickness had been consuming him seemed to be fading like morning mist. If Crenshaw comes back with more men, we won't be able to protect the evidence. Morrison nodded grimly. The boy's right. Blackwood will move fast once he realizes what happened here. We need to get you both somewhere safe and figure out our next move. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Celeste took one last look at the small room where she had grown up. The broken door hung crooked on its hinges, and blood stains marked the floor where Hartwell had died. But more than that, she could still feel the presence of her parents in every corner, every piece of furniture they had built with their own hands. We'll come back, she promised the empty rooms. Someday we'll fix this place up and make it beautiful again. The ride to the Hartwell Ranch took them through rolling hills covered with tall grass that waved in the morning breeze like ocean waves. Hundreds of cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, their red and brown coats gleaming in the sunlight. It was more wealth than Celeste had ever imagined, and it all belonged to her and Marcus now. The main house sat on a small rise overlooking the entire valley, a two-story building made of stone and timber that looked like it could stand for 100 years. Wide porches wrapped around both levels, and large windows caught the morning light like friendly eyes. It was beautiful and welcoming in a way that made Celeste's heart ache with longing. Inside, the house was even more impressive. The main room had a fireplace big enough to roast a whole cow, and the furniture was made of polished wood that reflected the light from crystal lamps. Paintings of horses and landscapes decorated the walls, and everywhere Celeste looked, she saw evidence of a man who had built something meaningful with his life. But they hadn't come for the tour. Morrison led them straight to Hartwell's study, a room lined with books and dominated by a massive oak desk. The top drawer was locked, but Morrison knew where Hartwell kept the key. Inside were the documents that could change everything, dozens of letters from families describing mysterious accidents, detailed maps showing which properties Blackwood wanted, and most damning of all, receipts for poison purchased under false names. Look at this, Marcus said, holding up a letter dated just 2 weeks ago. The Henderson family in Topeka. Their well water turned bad right after they refused to sell to Blackwood's men. Celeste studied the map, seeing red marks on properties all across central Kansas. Some were marked acquired, while others bore the ominous notation in progress. Their own farm was marked with a red X and the date of their parents' deaths. "How many families has he killed?" she whispered, feeling sick to her stomach. "Too many," Morrison replied. "But with this evidence, we can make sure he doesn't kill any more." A commotion outside the house interrupted their planning. Through the study window, they could see ranch hands running toward the main gate, pointing and shouting. In the distance, a cloud of dust marked the approach of multiple riders moving fast. "How many?" Morrison called to one of his men. "Looks like 20 or more, boss. They're flying Blackwood's colors." Morrison's face went pale. "He's brought an army. Must have gathered every gunman he could hire between here and Wichita." Celeste felt fear crawl up her spine like a cold snake. 20 armed men against Morrison's dozen cowboys was impossible odds. Even worse, if Blackwood captured them, the evidence would disappear and his crimes would continue unchecked. "There's a back trail through the hills," Morrison said quickly, gathering up the most important documents. "If we ride hard, we can reach Dodge City before they catch us. The sheriff there is honest. He'll listen to what we have to say." But Marcus was staring out the window with a strange expression on his face. "What if we don't run?" he said quietly. "Are you crazy?" Celeste demanded. "We can't fight 20 men." "We don't have to fight them," Marcus replied, his young face showing wisdom beyond his years. "We just have to outsmart them." He pointed to the massive stone fireplace in the main room. "Mr. Hartwell built this house to last. These walls are thick enough to stop bullets, and there's only one way in through the front door. If we can hold them off long enough, maybe help will come." Morrison looked skeptical. "What kind of help?" Marcus smiled, and for the first time since their parents died, Celeste saw their father's stubborn determination in her brother's eyes. "The kind that comes when good people hear that bad people are trying to hurt children." Outside, the sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Celeste realized they were out of time for planning. Whatever they were going to do, it had to happen now. She looked around the beautiful house that was now her home, at the evidence that could save so many families, and at her brother who seemed to have found his courage along with his health. James Hartwell had given them more than land and cattle. He had given them a chance to make a difference in the world. "All right," she said, picking up her father's rifle and checking to make sure it was loaded. "Let's see what the Wheeler children can do when they're fighting on their own land." Gunfire exploded across the peaceful morning as Blackwood's hired killers charged toward the main house, their war cries echoing off the stone walls like demons from hell. Celeste ducked below the windowsill as bullets shattered the glass above her head, sending crystal fragments raining down on the polished wooden floor of what had been James Hartwell's peaceful study just minutes before. "Stay low," Morrison shouted from his position near the front door, his rifle already smoking from his first shots. "They're trying to surround us." Through the broken window, Celeste could see at least 15 men spreading out across the ranch yard, using the barn and storage buildings for cover as they moved closer to the house. Their leader was easy to spot, a massive man with a black beard who rode a coal dark horse and carried 2 guns like he knew how to use them. "That's Dutch Carver," Morrison said grimly when he caught sight of the bearded giant. "Blackwood's brought in professional killers from as far as Texas. This isn't just about your land anymore. It's about silencing everyone who knows the truth." Marcus had positioned himself at a window on the other side of the room, his father's old hunting rifle steady in his small hands despite the chaos erupting around them. For a boy who had been near death just hours ago, he showed remarkable calm under fire. 8 men moving toward the back of the house," he reported, his voice clear and strong. "They're trying to get to the kitchen door." "Can't let them get inside," Morrison muttered, reloading his weapon with practiced speed. "Once they breach the house, we're finished." The sound of splintering would came from the rear of the building as someone began attacking the kitchen door with an axe. Each blow sent vibrations through the stone walls, and Celeste realized their fortress wasn't as impregnable as they had hoped. "We need more men," she said, firing through her window at a gunman who was getting too close to the front porch. "There are too many of them." "Help might be coming," Marcus said with surprising confidence. I sent Tommy Rodriguez to town before dawn with a message for Sheriff Caldwell. Celeste stared at her brother in amazement. When did you do that? While you were helping Morrison with the horses. Tommy's the fastest rider on the ranch, and his family has reason to hate Blackwood too. Marcus fired another shot, and one of the attackers stumbled backward. The Rodriguez place was burned out last month when they wouldn't sell. Morrison grinned despite their desperate situation. That boy's got more sense than most grown men. Tommy will get through. He knows every trail between here and Dodge City. But help was still hours away, and their attackers were getting bolder by the minute. Dutch Carver had dismounted and was directing his men like a general commanding troops, sending some to attack the kitchen while others laid down covering fire to keep the defenders pinned at their windows. They're bringing up something heavy, Marcus warned, pointing toward the barn where several men were dragging what looked like a small cannon. Celeste's heart sank. The house's stone walls might stop rifle bullets, but they wouldn't survive cannon fire. How long do we have? Not long enough, Morrison admitted. That's a mountain howitzer probably stolen from an army supply train. 1 or 2 shots from that thing, and they'll blow a hole big enough to drive a wagon through. The sound of the kitchen door finally giving way echoed through the house, followed by the thunder of boots on wooden floors. Shouts and gunfire erupted from the back of the building as Morrison's remaining men tried to stop the invaders from reaching the main rooms. We have to fall back, Morrison said, grabbing the most important documents from Hartwell's desk. There's a root cellar beneath the pantry stone walls 3 feet thick. We can make our last stand there. But as they prepared to retreat deeper into the house, a new sound reached them through the chaos, the distant blast of a horn, carried on the morning wind like a call to arms. Then another horn answered from a different direction, and another from somewhere beyond the hills. Marcus's face lit up with hope. That's not just Sheriff Caldwell coming. That's half the county. Through her window, Celeste could see confusion spreading among Blackwood's men as they heard the horn calls too. Dutch Carver was shouting orders, trying to reorganize his scattered forces, but several of his hired guns were already looking toward their horses with the nervous expressions of men who suddenly realized they might be outnumbered. The horn calls are a signal system the ranchers set up last year, Morrison explained, his own hope beginning to show. When one ranch is attacked, the others come running. Looks like word of Hartwell's death has spread faster than we thought. The mountain howitzer boomed like thunder, and part of the front wall exploded inward, filling the study with dust and rubble. But even as Blackwood's men cheered their success, the sound of approaching riders grew louder from multiple directions. Over the eastern hills came Sheriff Caldwell with a posse of 20 men, their badges glinting in the sunlight. From the south appeared the Barty Ranch crew, led by old Samuel Tucker himself despite his 70 years. And from the west charged the Rodriguez family with their cousins and neighbors, riding like avenging angels to settle old scores. Looks like the cavalry has arrived, Morrison said with satisfaction, rising to fire through the hole in the wall. Now let's see how brave these hired killers are when they're facing honest men instead of helpless children. Dutch Carver realized his situation had changed dramatically. Instead of attacking an isolated ranch house with superior numbers, he now faced a converging force of lawmen, ranchers, and angry farmers who had come to settle accounts with Blackwood's organization once and for all. Pull back, he roared to his men. To the horses. But Sheriff Caldwell's posse had positioned themselves to cut off the escape routes, and the other groups were closing in fast. Several of Blackwood's hired guns threw down their weapons and raised their hands rather than face a hopeless fight. Through the smoke and confusion, Celeste caught sight of a familiar figure among the sheriff's men. A thin man in an expensive suit who could only be Blackwood himself. He sat his horse like a king surveying his domain, apparently confident that money and influence would protect him even now. There he is, she said, pointing toward the well-dressed man. That's Blackwood. Morrison's eyes hardened like steel. Time to serve some justice. The battle was turning into a rout as more of Blackwood's men surrendered or fled. But Blackwood himself seemed in no hurry to leave, as if he still believed his wealth and connections made him untouchable. That confidence proved to be his downfall. As he sat calmly in his saddle, apparently giving orders to his remaining loyal men, Sheriff Caldwell rode up behind him with a pair of iron shackles. "Mr. Blackwood," the sheriff said in a voice that carried across the entire ranch yard, "you're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, and a whole list of other crimes that'll keep you busy in court for the next year." Blackwood's composure finally cracked. "You can't arrest me. I have connections in the territorial government, friends in Washington. I'll have your badge before sunset." "Maybe," Caldwell replied calmly, snapping the shackles around Blackwood's wrists. "But right now, you're just another criminal who thought he could buy his way out of justice." As the dust settled and the last of the gunmen were rounded up, Celeste and Marcus emerged from the damaged house to survey their new domain. The ranch yard was scarred by bullet holes and cannon damage, but the land itself remained beautiful and unspoiled. More importantly, they now possessed the evidence that would ensure Blackwood faced justice for his crimes against their family and so many others. The courthouse in Dodge City buzzed with nervous energy as dozens of witnesses waited to testify against the man who had terrorized families across central Kansas for over 2 years. Celeste sat in the front row, wearing a new blue dress that Morrison had insisted on buying for the occasion, while Marcus fidgeted beside her in his first real suit. "The people call Celeste Wheeler to the stand," announced the prosecutor, a serious young man named David Harrison who had traveled from Topeka specifically to handle this case. Walking to the witness chair, Celeste felt the weight of every eye in the packed courtroom. Blackwood sat at the defendant's table in an expensive suit, flanked by 3 lawyers who had cost him more money than most families saw in a lifetime. But despite his fine clothes and legal protection, he looked smaller somehow, diminished by the iron chains around his ankles and the certain knowledge that his empire was crumbling. "Miss Wheeler," Harrison began gently, "please tell the court about the night your parents died." For the next hour, Celeste recounted the events that had changed her life forever. The mysterious illness that struck her parents, the threats from Crenshaw's men, and the desperate choice she had made to sign away their land. Her voice remained steady as she described finding the evidence in Hartwell's desk and realizing that her parents' deaths had been deliberate murder disguised as natural disease. When she finished, the courtroom was silent except for the scratch of the court reporter's pen and the quiet sobbing of other families who had suffered similar losses. "Your witness," Harrison said to Blackwood's lead attorney, a thin man with cold eyes who reminded Celeste uncomfortably of Crenshaw. "Miss Wheeler," the defense lawyer began smoothly, "isn't it true that you were desperate to save your brother's life? Desperate enough to sign any document that might help you get money for medicine?" "Yes," Celeste replied honestly. "I would have done anything to save Marcus. And isn't it possible that, in your desperation, you misunderstood the nature of Mr. Blackwood's business arrangement? Perhaps what you interpreted as threats were simply legitimate offers to purchase your property." Celeste felt anger rising in her chest like heat from a forge. There was nothing legitimate about poisoning our cattle and contaminating our well water. There was nothing legitimate about making our parents sick so they would die slow, painful deaths. "Objection," the lawyer snapped. "The witness is speculating about causes of death that haven't been proven." But Judge Morrison, no relation to the ranch foreman, overruled the objection with a stern look. "The witness may answer based on evidence presented to this court." The trial continued for 3 more days as witness after witness took the stand to describe similar patterns of harassment, mysterious accidents, and suspicious deaths. The Rodriguez family testified about their barn fire. The Henderson family from Topeka described their poisoned well. Mrs. Sarah Coleman broke down in tears as she recounted watching her husband die from the same mysterious fever that had killed the Wheeler parents. But perhaps the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source, Crenshaw himself, who had been captured trying to flee to Mexico with a saddlebag full of Blackwood's money. Faced with the choice between hanging for murder or testifying against his former boss, Crenshaw chose to save his own neck by revealing the full scope of Blackwood's criminal operation. He called it softening up the resistance, Crenshaw testified in a voice barely above a whisper. Families who wouldn't sell got visited by accidents. Bad water, sick livestock, mysterious fires. If that didn't work, we'd use the poison stuff that looked like natural fever but killed slow and painful. And if the family still refused to sell? Harrison pressed. Crenshaw's hands shook as he answered. Then they joined their livestock in the ground. The courtroom erupted in angry shouts from the gallery, where family members of Blackwood's victims had gathered to see justice done. Judge Morrison had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. On the witness stand, Crenshaw looked like a broken man. The confident gunfighter who had threatened Celeste and Marcus was gone, replaced by someone who knew he would spend the rest of his life in prison if he was lucky enough to avoid the hangman's noose. "How many families?" Harrison asked quietly. "I lost count after 20, Crenshaw admitted. Blackwood kept detailed records in his safe. Names, dates, methods used. He was proud of his efficiency. When the prosecution rested its case, Blackwood's lawyers attempted a desperate defense based on claims that their client had been framed by business rivals and that the witnesses were lying for financial gain. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury of local farmers and ranchers had no sympathy for a man who had murdered their neighbors for profit. The verdict came back in less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Judge Morrison sentenced Blackwood to hang for murder, with additional life sentences for conspiracy, fraud, and terrorism. Several of his accomplices, including Crenshaw, received long prison terms in exchange for their cooperation. But for Celeste, the most important moment came after the trial ended, when Harrison approached her with news about the legal status of her family's original land. Since the deed was signed under duress and as part of a criminal conspiracy, the court has ruled it invalid, he explained with a smile. Your original homestead belongs to you again, free and clear. Marcus, who had been unusually quiet during the trial, suddenly perked up with interest. Does that mean we can go home? Celeste looked at her brother, then out the courthouse window toward the rolling hills where the Hartwell Ranch sprawled under the afternoon sun. Home was no longer just the small cabin where they had been born. Home was the land James Hartwell had entrusted to them, the responsibility he had placed on their shoulders, and the future he had asked them to build. We can visit any time we want, she said, putting her arm around Marcus's shoulders. But our real home is where we can do the most good for the most people. As they walked out of the courthouse into the bright Kansas sunshine, Morrison was waiting with horses and a wagon loaded with supplies. The foreman had become more than an employee. He was family now, one of the many people who had helped them discover that love and courage could triumph over greed and violence. Ready to go home, boss? He asked with a grin, using the title he had started calling Celeste the day after Hartwell's funeral. She looked back at the courthouse where justice had finally been served, then forward toward the ranch where hundreds of cattle grazed peacefully under the vast prairie sky. Somewhere in the distance, she could see the smoke rising from the chimney of their original cabin, which Morrison's men had repaired and furnished as a guest house for whenever she and Marcus wanted to remember where they came from. Ready, she said, climbing into the wagon beside her brother. Let's go build the future Mr. Hartwell dreamed about. As they rode west toward their new life, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise better days ahead for everyone who called the Kansas prairie home. Thunder rolled across the spring sky as Celeste stood before the largest gathering of ranchers and farmers in Kansas history, her hands trembling as she held the speech she had written and rewritten a dozen times. Nearly 300 people had traveled from across the territory to attend the first annual Hartwell Memorial Meeting. But now that the moment had arrived, she felt like a frightened 16-year-old girl pretending to be someone important. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice barely carrying over the restless crowd gathered in the main barn of what everyone now called the Wheeler Hartwell Ranch. 6 months ago, most of you had never heard my name. Today, we're here to talk about building something that will protect families like yours for generations to come. In the front row, Marcus sat with a proud smile on his healthy, sun-tanned face. The sick boy who had nearly died the previous autumn was gone, replaced by a confident 13-year-old who had grown 4 inches and gained 30 pounds since inheriting the ranch. Beside him sat Morrison, whose weathered hands bore new scars from the spring roundup, but whose eyes held the satisfaction of a man watching his adopted children succeed beyond his wildest dreams. The Blackwood gang is finished, Celeste continued, finding her confidence as she spoke. But there are other men like him in other territories, and there will be more in the future. We can't stop them by hiding on our own farms and hoping they'll leave us alone." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. These were people who had lived in fear for too long, families who had lost loved ones to the kind of organized cruelty that Blackwood had perfected. They had come here not just to honor James Hartwell's memory, but to find a way to ensure such horrors never happened again. "What are you proposing?" called out Samuel Tucker from the Barty Ranch, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been fighting claim jumpers and cattle thieves since before Celeste was born. Celeste took a deep breath and unfolded the document she and Morrison had spent weeks preparing. "I'm proposing we form the Kansas Ranchers Protection Association. Not just a social club or a business group, but a real organization with teeth." She began reading from her carefully prepared plan. Every member ranch would contribute money and men to a common defense fund. When one member is threatened, everyone responds. We'll hire our own investigators to track down criminals before they can establish themselves. We'll work with honest lawmen like Sheriff Caldwell to make sure justice gets served quickly and fairly. "And who's going to run this association?" asked Maria Rodriguez, whose family had rebuilt their burned barn with help from neighboring ranches. "Who decides when to act and how much money to spend?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a branding iron. Celeste had known it was coming, but she still felt her stomach twist with nervousness. At 16, she was younger than most of the people in the barn by 20 years or more. What right did she have to lead an organization that could shape the future of the entire territory? But then she caught sight of Margaret Hartwell's locket hanging around her neck, and she remembered the dying rancher's words about taking care of each other and never letting the bullies win. "I'd like to nominate Marcus and Celeste Wheeler for president and vice president," Morrison said, standing up with the kind of confidence that came from 15 years of earning respect the hard way. "They've already proven they can stand up to men twice their size and 3 times their meanness." "They're just children," protested John Hawkins from the Flying H Ranch. "Running a protection association takes experience with money, politics, and dealing with dangerous people." "So does running the biggest ranch in 3 counties," replied Sarah Coleman, the widow whose husband had died from Blackwood's poison. "And they've been doing that just fine for 6 months. The debate that followed was passionate but respectful, with families sharing their concerns about putting so much responsibility on such young shoulders. But as person after person stood up to tell stories about how Celeste and Marcus had helped them during the difficult winter months, sharing cattle feed when supplies ran low, sending ranch hands to help with repairs, opening their doors to families who had nowhere else to turn, a consensus began to emerge. All in favor of electing Celeste Wheeler as president of the Kansas Ranchers Protection Association? Called out Tucker. Hands rose throughout the barn slowly at first, then with gathering momentum until nearly every person in the building was showing their support. Celeste felt tears sting her eyes as she realized these hard-working people were willing to trust her with their safety and their futures. And all in favor of Marcus Wheeler as vice president? Another sea of hands, accompanied by cheers and applause that echoed off the barn rafters like thunder. Marcus stood and waved, his young face glowing with pride and determination. But the celebration was interrupted by the sound of rapidly approaching horses. Through the open barn doors, everyone could see a lone rider pushing his mount at dangerous speed across the prairie, dust streaming behind him like a war banner. "That's Tommy Rodriguez," Morrison said, recognizing the young man's distinctive riding style. "He's supposed to be watching the north pasture." Tommy burst into the barn, his horse lathered with sweat and his own face pale with exhaustion. "Miss Celeste, we got big trouble coming." The crowd fell silent as Tommy struggled to catch his breath. 3 wagons full of armed men, maybe 40 or 50 guns total. They're flying Colorado Territory flags, but they don't look like any soldiers I ever seen. Celeste felt ice form in her stomach. How far out? Maybe 2 hours if they keep moving at their current pace. But they stopped at the Morrison place to water their horses, and old Pete said they were asking questions about you and Marcus. The implications hit everyone in the barn at the same time. Word of Blackwood's defeat and the Wheeler children's newfound wealth had apparently spread beyond Kansas, attracting the attention of other criminal organizations who thought 2 young ranch owners might be easy targets. "This is our first test," Celeste said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly tense barn. 40 men against 300. Those are pretty good odds. But Samuel Tucker shook his grizzled head. "Not everyone here is a fighter, Missy. We got women and children, older folks who came for a peaceful meeting. We can't ask them to face down professional killers." "We don't have to," Marcus said, stepping forward with surprising authority. "But we can't run away either, or every outlaw gang between here and California will think we're easy pickings." Morrison nodded approvingly. "The boy's right. If we back down now, we'll be fighting the same battle over and over again." Celeste looked around the barn at the faces of people who had chosen to trust her leadership just minutes before. Some showed fear, others determination, but all of them were looking to her for guidance in the first real crisis of her presidency. "Anyone who wants to leave can go now with no hard feelings," she announced. "Take your families somewhere safe and wait for this to blow over. But anyone who stays is going to help us send a message that Kansas families don't bow down to bullies." To her amazement, less than a dozen people chose to leave. The rest began organizing themselves with the efficiency of people who had faced danger before and survived. Men checked their weapons while women gathered supplies and ammunition. Children were sent to secure hiding places while older teenagers prepared to serve as messengers and lookouts. As the barn transformed into a military command center, Celeste felt the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate girl trying to save her brother's life. Now she was responsible for the safety of hundreds of people who were counting on her to make the right decisions. But along with the weight came a sense of purpose that made her stand straighter and think clearer. James Hartwell had chosen her for this moment, had seen something in her that she was only now beginning to understand herself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as 47 armed men in dusty clothes rode into view, their weapons glinting like promises of violence in the golden light. Their leader was a massive man with a braided black beard who sat his horse like a king surveying territory he intended to conquer, while his followers spread out in a loose formation that suggested military training despite their civilian appearance. Celeste stood on the front porch of the main house, flanked by Morrison and Marcus, trying to project more confidence than she felt. Behind the windows and around the corners of buildings, nearly 200 ranch hands, farmers, and determined neighbors waited with loaded rifles. But the sight of so many professional fighters was enough to make anyone's hands shake. "You must be the famous Wheeler children," the bearded leader called out, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested origins in the Deep South. "I'm Captain Wade Garrison, late of the Confederate Army and currently representing certain business interests from Colorado Territory." "This is private property," Celeste replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "You and your men need to turn around and ride out." Garrison laughed, a sound like gravel sliding down a metal chute. "Oh, we'll be leaving soon enough, little girl. But not empty-handed." He gestured toward his men, who began dismounting and taking positions that would give them clear shots at the house. "You see, word has traveled about your recent good fortune, inheriting the biggest ranch in Kansas, winning a fat settlement from Blackwood's estate, becoming quite the little cattle baroness." Marcus stepped forward, his young voice carrying surprising authority. "We earned everything we have by standing up to bullies, just like we're going to stand up to you." "Brave words from a boy who's never seen real combat," Garrison replied. "But bravery without experience just gets people killed faster." From his position behind a water trough, Tommy Rodriguez called out a warning. "Miss Celeste, more riders coming from the east." Celeste's heart sank as she saw another group of mounted men approaching across the prairie. If Garrison had brought reinforcements, their carefully planned defense would collapse under overwhelming numbers. But as the new riders drew closer, she began to make out familiar faces. Sheriff Caldwell led the group, his badge catching the sunlight, while behind him rode deputies from 3 different counties and a dozen men wearing the blue uniforms of territorial marshals. "Looks like the law has finally caught up with you, Garrison," Caldwell called out as his men took positions surrounding the ranch yard. "You're under arrest for armed robbery, cattle theft, and murder in Colorado Territory." Garrison's confident expression flickered for the first time. You have no jurisdiction here, Sheriff. This is Kansas, not Colorado. These gentlemen would disagree, Caldwell replied, nodding toward the territorial marshals. Seems there's federal warrants out for you and most of your men. Something about robbing army supply trains and selling weapons to hostile Indian tribes. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with Garrison's men looking nervously between their leader and the growing number of lawmen surrounding them. Several of the outlaws began edging toward their horses, clearly calculating their chances of fighting their way out versus the certainty of hanging if they were captured. But it was Marcus who broke the tension in a way no one expected. Walking calmly down the porch steps, the 13-year-old approached Garrison's horse with the fearless confidence of someone who had faced death and survived. "Mr. Garrison," he said politely, "you made a mistake coming here, not just because you're outnumbered, but because you don't understand what this place represents." Garrison stared down at the boy, clearly confused by this unexpected development. "And what does it represent, child?" "Hope," Marcus replied simply. "Hope that families can build something good without fear of having it stolen. Hope that children can grow up safe and strong. Hope that good people can work together to protect each other from men like you." Around the ranch yard, Celeste could see the effect of her brother's words on both friends and enemies. The defenders stood straighter, their weapons steadier, while several of Garrison's men looked uncomfortable with their leader's plan to rob children and terrorize families. "You can kill us," Marcus continued, his young voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "You can burn down our buildings and steal our cattle. But you can't kill hope. And you can't stop other people from standing up to bullies just because they saw us do it first." Garrison's hand moved toward his gun, but before he could draw, one of his own men spoke up from the back of the group. "Captain, maybe we should just ride on. These folks ain't hurt nobody, and there's easier pickings elsewhere." "Yeah," agreed another outlaw. "I signed on to rob banks and rustle cattle, not to murder children in front of their neighbors." Celeste watched with amazement as doubt spread through Garrison's ranks like wildfire. These weren't faceless monsters. They were men with consciences, and Marcus had found a way to reach the humanity that still existed in some of them. But Garrison himself seemed immune to appeals to his better nature. Drawing his gun with a snarl of rage, he pointed it directly at Marcus's chest. "Enough talk. The boy dies first, then the girl, then anyone else who wants to play hero." The shot that rang out echoed across the prairie like thunder, but it wasn't Garrison who fired. Sheriff Caldwell's rifle spoke first, and the outlaw leader tumbled from his horse to lie still in the dusty ranch yard. In the chaos that followed, most of Garrison's men threw down their weapons and surrendered rather than face the combined firepower of lawmen and angry ranchers. A few tried to fight, but they were quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers and righteous fury. When the dust settled, 13 outlaws lay dead while the rest sat in chains, waiting to be transported to territorial prisons where they would face justice for their crimes across multiple states. "How did you know to come here?" Celeste asked Sheriff Caldwell as his men began loading prisoners into wagons. "Got a telegraph message from the governor himself," Caldwell replied with a grin. "Seems your reputation has reached all the way to the territorial capital. The governor said Kansas needs to protect its most valuable citizens, the ones who stand up for what's right." As the prisoners were led away and the crowd of defenders began to disperse, Celeste found herself standing with Marcus and Morrison on the porch where the confrontation had begun. The ranch yard bore scars from the brief battle, but the land itself remained beautiful and unspoiled. "Think they'll be back?" Marcus asked, watching the dust clouds fade as the last of the lawmen departed with their captives. "Maybe," Morrison replied, "but word will spread about what happened here today. Every outlaw gang between here and California will think twice before tangling with the Kansas Ranchers Protection Association." Celeste fingered the silver locket at her throat, thinking about James Hartwell's final words about taking care of each other and never letting the bullies win. They had honored his memory today, but more importantly, they had proven that his faith in them had been justified. "We did it," she said quietly. "We actually did it. We did what we had to do." Marcus corrected with wisdom beyond his years. And we'll keep doing it for as long as it takes. As the sun climbed higher in the Kansas sky, painting the prairie in shades of gold and green, Celeste looked out over the land that had become their responsibility and their legacy. Somewhere in the distance, cattle grazed peacefully while ranch hands went about their daily work, secure in the knowledge that their home was protected by more than just guns and walls. It was protected by the unbreakable bonds of community, the courage of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and the enduring power of hope to triumph over fear.